the late first century in the 90s. And he was a Jewish general originally. He grew up, he was from a Jewish family from the Levitical stock, the tribe of Levi, and he was actually from a priestly family. So he could have served in the temple. He went to Galilee and was put in charge, in command of the forces, the Jewish forces up in the north. His Josephus troops were defeated and Josephus was taken prisoner. Josephus then turned sides and worked for the Romans, helping them to try and get the Jews to surrender in Jerusalem.
He was captured and then the Romans gave him all of their historical records, and he wrote some tremendous work.
He was so useful to the Romans that they gave him the court records of King Herod the Great. And they also gave Josephus the temple books that were contained in the holy place by the priests.
Out of all the historical records that he was given by the Romans, he wrote some amazing and outstanding works that are used today by many people in trying to understand and study the first century. I think the history of the Jews is one, and then the wars of the Jews is the other. So he was a great historian.
Herodotus, who is known in general as the father of history, was not an eyewitness to the events that he wrote about, whereas Josephus, particularly in his book, The Wars of the Jews, he was there.
And a lot of people to this day accuse him of being an exaggerator, and his works aren't to be taken seriously. But I think as we see the facts that are presented in this presentation, we're going to find that Josephus was the real deal, and that what he had to say in the past is valid evidence and proof of what really happened in the first century.
When he's describing the dimensions of this structure or that structure, he was there. He lived there. He was there at the destruction and even after the destruction. So we have to account and give him credit for what he saw and what he reported, because he was on the scene.
When people seek to look backward in time, there is a common lens available to look backward through, and millions upon millions of people have used it. The time lens is located at the Israeli Museum. The lens is a miniature rendering of the city of Jerusalem in the first century. The model came from the creative mind of the late Avi Yonah, and in 1973, it was his view of first century Jerusalem and what it looked like then. Today, it remains the world's most authoritative representation of how Jerusalem and the temple looked in those days. But is it accurate? To date, no one has ever questioned its accuracy nor its authenticity. Take a close look at the size, location, and design of the Antonia Fortress. Compared to the temple area, the fortress of Antonia is very small. While Avi Yonah claims he derived his model's design from the writings of Flavius Josephus, on closer examination of the writings of Josephus, we will find enormous discrepancies between Avi's model and the actual writings of the eyewitness account of Flavius Josephus. When Josephus talked about the Antonia Fortress, he said when you approached from the north, which is what we're doing now, this is the northern wall of the Harem or the Temple Mount. He said that the Antonia Fortress was so big that it even obstructed your view of the temple. If the Antonia Fortress was to the west and as small as Avi Yonah created it to be, then it doesn't fit the message of Flavius Josephus. You could not see the temple from this direction as you approach the north wall.
Now as to the Fortress Antonia, the inward parts have the largeness and form of a palace, it being parted into all kinds of rooms, and other conveniences such as courts, and places for bathing, and broad spaces for camps. Insomuch that by having all the conveniences that cities wanted, it might seem to be composed of several cities, but by its magnificence it seemed a palace. Flavius Josephus, Wars of the Jews.
A stream of Muslim people are getting ready to go up on top of the harem. So we're going to go through this Lion's Gate, which feeds on to the Via Dolorosa, which I think means the way of grief. And it's according to the Greeks. David, one of the things that grieves me to my bones is how they have displayed this Temple Mount model along with the Antonia Fortress. And this Iona guy that claims that he used Flavius Josephus' statements and specifications wherewith to design his model. Kind of a cool tractor. But I've read Flavius Josephus' explanation for the Antonia Fortress specifically, and what he says is not anywhere close to way the model that Iona designed looked. I think the first thing that comes to my mind concerning his the size of his Antonia, Iona's Antonia, is that it's really small.
Yes.
It just doesn't look like it could contain the numerous troops of the 10th Legion.
Josephus says that it contained, Antonia was able to contain a tagma, a legion of troops. And it's interesting that even the English translations change that word from legion, where it is everywhere else in Josephus, and they change it to cohort, which has no relationship to the original Greek term. So it's just amazing. It's not just the descriptors, those who describe graphically or through modeling Fortress Antonia, but also those who do the translations.
And not only that, it's everybody. It seems like it's in all his model is in all the encyclopedias, all the religious literature. It's kind of like the lens even the layman uses to look back into the 1st century, but that lens is flawed.
Josephus said that it was larger and more massive than the temple, and this meant the entire expanse of
it wasn't.
Antonia.
It's 35 acres up there.
Yeah.
Wasn't that the size of the average Roman fort? About 30?
Of the time that Herod built it, yes.
All the forts were modeled after a certain template.
Correct.
And the Antonia Fortress was even though it was trapezoidal, most of the fortresses were rectangular, and this is a little bit off, but it still was basically, in terms of acreage, the same size.
Right. Herod made accommodation for the geology of the area, which is normal.
Yeah.
And he wasn't specifically a Roman, but we can be assured that he used the best Roman architects and the best Roman construction methods to build this massive, massive structure, much larger than the temple.
Well, there's other things I want to talk about that Iona missed as well, and I think the minute you look at that model, the first thing you notice, apart from the size, is the towers. All those towers are uniform.
On Aviona's model, yes.
Now, as to the Fortress Antonia, the entire structure resembled that of a tower. It also contained 4 other distinct towers at its 4 corners, whereof the others were but 50 cubits high. That which lay upon the southeast corner was 70 cubits, that from thence the whole temple might be viewed. Flavius Josephus, Wars of the Jews.
But according to Josephus, the southeast tower was measurably much taller.
Yeah, 1/3 taller than the other.
And that was because they had to use that tower to look into the Jewish temple to make sure the Jews weren't doing anything, hanky-panky.
And if you had a correct perspective of the relationship from Antonia to the temple, you could see, indeed, you could look into the temple from that perspective, but not from Abiona's a model. It's impossible.
The Antonia fortress was home to over 6,000 troops of the 10th Legion, so Jonah's depiction of Antonia was far too small to contain such a great number of men. But Jonah made another curious miscalculation in his design. The fortress Antonia in Jonah's model is noticeably offset and extends outward from the western wall, and this again is not consistent with Josephus' eyewitness account. And while this is an almost unnoticeably small issue, the insight into why Jonah designed it this way uncovers a colossal insight as to why the location for the Jewish temple today remains so uncertain, elusive, and misplaced. What caused Jonah to ignore Flavius Josephus' eyewitness account? Every Friday afternoon, pilgrims from many Christian backgrounds gather at the Via Dolorosa, or the Way of Grief. The famous road is at the northeastern part of the old city of Jerusalem. The ancient roadway was originally built by Hadrian in the 2nd century, and it was at this time Hadrian also placed paving stones in the area as well. But it was only from the time of the 12th century, 1,000 years later, that it became known as the Via Dolorosa by the Franciscan monks, who deemed it to be the very way Jesus traveled on his way to being crucified. The route ends conveniently at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Along this Via Dolorosa, there are different stopping points called Stations of the Cross. One of the first stations along the Via Dolorosa is called the Station of Flagellations or Whippings, a holy gathering place for Christians. But what does this have to do with the A.V. Jonah model and the Antonia fortress being offset to the west? Jesus was beaten and whipped on the pavement of the Antonia fortress. This pavement, it was thought by the Franciscan monks, was the very site where Jesus was whipped and beaten. It was concluded that this therefore must have been the site of the Antonia fortress. Yet it was the pavement stones laid down by Hadrian at the same time he built the road. But in the 12th century, the Franciscan monks prevailed on the Crusaders to erect this building, which has remained for 800 years. Notice how it is in the exact location of Jonah's model today, on the northwest corner. As we see it from a northern point of view, it reveals that the building is overlapping the line and extending outward from the western wall, the same as in Jonah's model. But Josephus indicated the fortress was flush with the western wall. Yet this pavement, claimed to be the floor of the Antonia fortress, extends west of the line of the western wall, contrary to the description of Josephus. Just as Christians, Jonah accepted the pavement stones as the actual site of the Antonia fortress. Thus he had to place the Antonia fortress in his model offset to the west in order to cover the paving stones of Hadrian and thus accommodate what he considered historical fact. But this was not the pavement nor the site of the Antonia fortress. This pavement was laid down by Hadrian 100 years after the death of Jesus. The bias of Jonah's model and the ongoing commemoration by the Christians every Friday afternoon perpetuate the view that the Antonia fortress was a diminutive little appendage northwest and offset of the so-called Temple Mount, when in fact the Antonia fortress sat on a massive 35-acre parcel of land that housed the entire 10th Legion of over 6,000 men and hundreds more who supported them, and did so for some 300 years up until Constantine. This enormous mistake has clouded the truth and kept the Jewish people from locating the proper site for their temple. As we shall see, by not listening to Flavius Josephus, A.V. Jonah made other significant mistakes in his first century model.
Okay, so what you can see, Ken, is that what A.V. Jonah presents as, I used Josephus as my model, as my guide to developing my model, rather. That's not the case. He's very selective in choosing what he accepts and what he doesn't, because they feel that what they see today is not what Josephus was talking about, and they go with their eyes rather than what the eyewitness says.
Yeah, amazing. Flavius Josephus, in his Wars of the Jews, makes specific reference to a significant feature of the Herodian temple complex that was totally ignored in the Aviona model.
Now, as to the Fortress Antonia, it was situated at the corner of two cloisters of the court of the temple, of that on the west and that of the north. Flavius Josephus.
Before the final destruction of the temple, Titus stood at the southern wall of the Antonia fortress and directed the final battle between the Romans and the Jews, which, according to Josephus, was waged upon two arms or colonnades. These two colonnades stretched 600 feet and connected the temple and the Antonia fortress. Yet, these two colonnades, so vividly discussed by Josephus, do not appear in the Iona model.
And so I want to talk to you about this statement that Flavius Josephus made about the two arms that connected the Antonia fortress with the temple, because only in Dr. Ernest Martin's discoveries do I find any information about this. It seems like it's a big missing link, and so I'd like you to help us understand what Josephus said about it, but talk to us about what Flavius Josephus said and how significant it is in the design problem of the Aviona model as opposed to Dr. Ernest Martin's model.
Well, Dr. Ernest Martin's model just read Josephus normally, as a normal reader would read it, that there were two arms, two colonnades, which were like limbs that went from Fortress Antonia to the temple. And the reason Josephus keys on this is because it was a major factor in conquering the temple area. And Josephus says that a major battle took place on those two colonnades, back and forth, and that the warriors were pushing. When you fight with a shield and a sword and a helmet on your head, and people behind you, you have two groups that are pushing against each other, back and forth, and Josephus describes that wave back and forth of the two combatant groups fighting for control of this, what we would call a bridge, and what Josephus called colonnades. And this was a major turning point where, the Romans were not able to get control of the bridge and entrance to the temple, and therefore they had to find a different way in.
Why do you suppose that other scholars haven't understood these two arms? Maybe it's because it's called two arms, and without understanding the battle, you wouldn't see how much Josephus emphasized it. Maybe, do you think that's the reason why it hasn't come out?
Well, that whole description that Josephus says makes no sense if you think that the temple was here, instead of where it actually was, farther south, and that this was Fortress Antonia.
So people's biases would blind them to understanding the arms, and had not Josephus gone in length discussing the battle, and it must have been, Titus must have been up on that wall up there, right up there, looking down at the battle on the two arms, and it's, because I recall reading it myself, that Titus actually watched that battle take place that emphasized the two arms that connected the Antonia fortress with the temple.
Yeah, the description that Josephus gives is actually like a script description of what was going on, blow by blow, even getting down to individuals who were fighting in that particular battle and naming them. This is not something you would just make up. And yes, Titus was directing the battle, directing the flow of this battle with hundreds of men on both sides in this two narrow spaces connecting the Antonia to the temple.
And Herod would have wanted that connection because he would want to have access. Those colonnades were built so that his troops could get to the temple area right away.
Yes.
And quell any kind of disturbance by the Jews, because they were a pretty rowdy bunch in those days.
Yeah, Josephus says they were rioting all the time, And for security reasons, you wanted to have access to the temple from the fortress immediately without having to go through masses of people to quell the riot or the disturbance that would be occurring in the temple.
So the Antonia model, the Antonia temple model that we see in the Israeli museum today, doesn't even come close. There's no connection of those two arms or those two colonnades at all. It's not connected at all. You don't see any connection. But it goes on to say, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that those two colonnades connected on the northwest corner
Of the temple.
To
Antonia.
To Antonia. But there's no reference to those colonnades in that model. There's nothing. It's totally void. So, but that model is a major looking glass that people use to try to understand the first century Antonia and the temple. Let's take another look over here so that we have a great reference point. That southwest corner is probably where the beginning of those colonnades stretched down towards the city of David to the south.
Right.
And of course they're gone today because that would have been part of the temple complex that was destroyed